Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So this week, we decided we would have a little fun. We all have our favorite TV or movie therapist, and it turns out that we believe a lot of our listeners do too, because people write in sometimes and ask us what we think about certain portrayals. So we're going to talk about therapists and analysts, psychiatrists on the screen and television and film. And what we realized as we were preparing for this episode is there is no shortage. There are so many examples of therapists in television and film. So we know we're not going to get to them all. We're sure that we're probably going to miss some obvious ones and some favorites, but we're going to rifle through and see what we find and what we can learn about therapy by looking at therapy on the screen.
Hey, before we jump into this episode, I just wanted to remind people that we do have a Patreon page, which allows those of you who have found our podcast helpful, useful, and some people tell us even deeply healing, a way for you to help us continue to do this work. As part of our Patreon community, we encourage people to submit questions, submit dreams, to interact with us, and we respond by doing special episodes to respond to questions and dreams that have been submitted to us. So there's a very kind of intimate handshake that we all can have through Patreon. So please consider stopping by. For as little as $5 a month, you can make a substantial difference in helping us fund this venture. We've resisted bringing in corporate sponsors because we don't feel like our mission is congruent with, well, frankly, pretty much any other commercial venture. So in order to keep that clean and direct and in integrity with our work, that means we need you to help us do that. So click on the link to Patreon, which is down at the bottom of this page and on almost every episode page. Take a look at it and consider being generous. Thanks.
Lisa, when you were suggested us having this as a topic, and there's a list online, and then we came up with more and more and more examples. You know, what I first thought about is the therapists that I like on screen. And then there are the ones that I don't like. And so it's so funny and interesting to me that there is sort of a transference reaction to an entirely fictional character.
Yeah. Well, and I always find that whenever there's a TV show or a movie with a therapist in it, I'm always like a little bit on tenterhooks because I'm waiting to see if it will be portrayed relatively accurately. So many times it's kind of ridiculous and over the top, and the therapist is saying things that, no therapist who's decent would ever say, or are kind of doing terrible things, and it just doesn't. You can't continue the suspension of disbelief because it's so kind of grossly exaggerated, But then when they get it right, it's kind of compelling.
Well, I have to admit that my distorted perception of clinicians started when I was 3 years old, and I was entranced by Lost in Space. And Dr. Zachary Smith, who was both the great despot of Lost in Space, was also a psychiatrist, whose apparently only friend on that show was a little boy. He was a bit younger than me, but I identified with Will Robinson very much and wished I had my own robot. But but yes, all of my experiences of psychiatrists have been shaped by Dr. Smith, apparently.
So I loved that show too. And wasn't he even an analyst? I think he may have been a Freudian analyst as well. But he's a real bad guy. He's very manipulative and selfish, and he kind of manipulates Will, and then he always gets kind of found out in the end and kind of squeals his apology. He is the bad guy in the show, but he's also very sort of anxious, isn't he?
Well, he really is the Mercurius of the show, because the whole premise of the show is that there are all these scientists, all kind of left-brained, clear-thinking engineers. They're going on this aeronautic adventure, and then Dr. Smith is the strange, wacky agent that gets inserted into the show. Actually, he steals on board, throws the gravitational trajectory of the ship in the wrong direction, and they wind up cast into these bizarre interplanetary adventures. And Dr. Smith is the one that often gets them into trouble. He's often got a terrible scheme of one kind or another, both to get back to the Earth, but also to serve his libidinal interests in one way or another. So he, in his wildness, he is the unconscious factor.
Oh, that's great. I had forgotten all of that. That's really
selfish and flamboyant and demanding, and he's often the most vulnerable. He gets sucked into all of these crazy schemes that are going on, and and is the one who's saved by his tenderness for Will Robinson, because he's ruthlessly psychopathic, but then he'll turn around and he'll see that he's putting this kid at risk, and all of a sudden this better side of him will come out.
Okay.
So he, to me, is one of the most interesting characters, the one who is the most unstable and wild, and also where the unconscious comes in to the process and is hilarious as you look at it now as an adult. So
that's great.
Dangerously, I might be unconsciously modeling myself after Dr. Smith, which could really be a problem now that I'm confessing that.
I can see it now, Joseph.
You can see it.
I'm wondering if having a psychotherapist on board is part of intergalactic space travel. Because in Star Trek, there was Deanna, whose last name I can't remember.
Deanna Troi.
Thank you. And she was all good.
The perfect person, really.
She was kind and she was empathic. She had no shadow, unlike Dr. Smith.
Well, she had a heck of a mother complex. Because, I don't know if you remember that, but her mother, who was a complete telepath, would get up on the show and she could read everybody's individual thoughts and move them all around like chess pieces.
And she was always trying to get in bed with Jean-Luc Picard, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. To Counselor Troi's horror and embarrassment. That was her shadow.
I'm pretty sure you're right. Her mother was a shadow. And if I'm not mistaken, oh gosh, I hope I'm not wrong about this. I think that Deanna Troi's mother was actually played by Gene Roddenberry's wife.
Oh, that would be so great. I hope that's
so
true.
incestuous.
But yeah, Deanna Troi was great, right? She was an empath. So she came by her therapeutic prowess very naturally because she was this non-human species that was just naturally could sort of feel other people's emotions. And so on the bridge, they'd be communicating with some hostile species, and Deanna would suddenly look very very overcome, and she would be receiving kind of telepathic communication from the entity, and she would sort of swoon. So she was really that kind of anima woman on the show as well.
She could channel. She could channel alien species, and there was nothing that she couldn't relate to and decode. This was sort of like, reminds me of a modern day Freud who said, nothing human is foreign to me. Well, Deanna took it one step further, as there was nothing non-human that she couldn't relate to.
Actually one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, though, featured Deanna. It's the one where she's trying to... She's like applying for her commander status or whatever. I'm going to get the jargon wrong, but she has to take a test, and she has to take a written test. And she, of course, does brilliantly on that. But then there's a holodeck simulation. And in the holodeck simulation, the hull is about to breach and the whole ship is going to explode in 30 seconds, as often happens on Star Trek, by the way. And she has to decide what to do. And she keeps on failing the simulation again and again and again until finally she gets it right. The thing she has to do is allow Geordi LaForge to crawl into the Jeffries tubes and do something which will mean that he will be killed. It is absolutely certainty that he will be sacrificed, but the ship will be saved. And it's so hard for her to sacrifice Geordi. To me, this is a real kind of image of what many women, and in fact, many therapists have to be able to do. I remember Marie-Louise von Franz talks about how some analysts find it very difficult to let their client burn in their own hell. But that is important sometimes. So that way where we need to find a little bit of ruthlessness, that is important for being a good therapist, rather than always being just the too good mother.
I always sort of resonate to that word of a kind of ruthlessness, and I would substitute kind of just the reality principle and truthfulness, which brings up one of my favorite therapists, Robin Williams, in Good Will Hunting. And his down-to-earthness and his willingness to challenge and be tough, and his humanity, where he's always calling his this young man, "Okay, Chief, what's up, Chief?" I like that kind of down and dirty, two human beings really encountering one another.
I remember that scene in Good Will Hunting where Matt Damon is full of a lot of bluster, but he reveals that this kind of terrible circumstance had happened in his childhood. And Robin Williams, as the therapist, just keeps repeating, "It wasn't your fault.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't your fault." And it's a brilliantly acted scene because Damon he laughs and he pushes back and all of the defense mechanisms that play out before he finally just weeps with the grief of this moment in his childhood and the courage and wisdom that Robin Williams' character needs to hold in order to keep pressing into this neurotic isolation, in our terms, this pocket of suffering that he couldn't find without this penetrating connection. In some ways, it's the moment where the therapeutic relationship finally happens, because the young man can really have a true emotional experience with the therapist who holds it with him in the right way. And it's also a story about male bonding as well, because some of the wounds had to do with his family, that Robin Williams provides a kind of good father to him that he just simply couldn't access.
So there's an emotional truth that can come across on the screen that we resonate to. And when it goes the other way, as with Dr. Smith or my other non-favorite but hilarious psychiatrist, is the psychiatrist in What About Bob? who is so egocentric and so taken with himself and so inflated that what makes it hilarious is that Goofy Bob, traveling to visit his psychiatrist on vacation in New Hampshire with his goldfish in a bowl, comes off as actually being the more human and the more therapeutic of the two.
It goes again to that spirit mercurius that kind of invades the structure, the holding tank, and turns everything upside down. And if it works in the right way, can act as a healing agent, even in the midst of all the chaos that it brings. But yes, Bill Murray is unbelievably funny in that movie. And part of the funny is that he's so transgressive, that he's doing all of these things that we would be embarrassed to do. And then consequently, it's so much fun to see it play out.
There are many comedic therapists. I'm thinking of What About Bob? And of course, there's a lot of kind of therapy scenes in Woody Allen that can be very funny. I'm also remembering this show that was on the Cartoon Network back in the 90s. It was actually when I was in social work school. So I was training to be a therapist, or I was a newly minted therapist. And it was this animated show called Dr. Katz. And the patients were always voiced by comedians. And Dr. Katz was kind of screwed up. He was divorced, and he had this sort of ne'er-do-well son who was always kind of getting into trouble. And Dr. Katz was way too soft on him. And he had this ridiculous receptionist that Dr. Katz also didn't set good limits with. And he was just like a little bit of a wreck in a very sort of endearing way. And I just loved that show. It always made me laugh.
So I think the comedic part of therapy is a really important dynamic. When I used to work in the hospital as a medical social worker, which is quite different than therapy, but we're still in that human services realm, we would go into the back room and we would share absurd stories and sometimes laugh until we cried. And I wanted to reassure people that it was not an effort at cruelty in any way. It was this need to transcend the sometimes overwhelming suffering that was going on around us and take refuge in some kind of absurd transcendence. I think that therapy is sometimes so sincere, so painful, so intense and irrational that we are saved by finding the humor in it, whether it's with the client or by ourselves as we're just, having a glass of wine at the end of the day, to be able to find some laughter. And I know that I have found at certain moments people have talked about a complex and they'll talk about it in this particular configuration that can make both of us burst into laughter.
Oh, yeah.
And I often feel like that's the key.
Yes.
Like if we could just laugh at ourselves, we could kind of get through the crack, to the other side of all of this.
Well, one of my favorite scenes from Dr. Katz is the patient comes in and Dr. Katz says, how are you? Are you sleeping better? And the patient says, well, I don't know. Better than what? And Dr. Katz goes, better than me? and I was like, oh, I can relate to that, So it is that really kind of human place, I think.
And I think that that comedy is really part of self-reflection. That on the one hand, oh, my life is tough and miserable and so on. Then again, I can step back, look at it as if from above, and see the absurdity of it. See myself as funny. And comedy does help us transcend. And I think there are many moments of laughter in our consulting rooms. People are much more familiar with emotional, tearful, sort of heartrending scenes. But laughter is part of it too.
Which brings me to Frasier, that really great TV series that I actually came to appreciate once I was a little bit older. I think it's been around for a long time. I was a bit too young when it first came out to really understand the dance, and that his ex-wife was Lilith. It's really, really interesting as well. Like I didn't get that till a long time after all of that. And hilariously, over the years, I have had a handful of clients tell me that I remind them of Frasier. But there's something
that's better
about
than
that.
Reminding you of Dr. Smith.
That's right. They just knew me better. They'd seen the Dr. Smith. but that what kind of hyper intellectual aesthete prepresentation, and I didn't dig into
prissy.
It enough. Clearly, a little prissy and a little over curated. But also well-meaning and good-humored as well. It's fun. It's fun to get that tossed back to me. But coming to some of the episodes now and really seeing how that's navigated. And Bob Newhart, of course, was the precursor to Frasier.
Yes,
and I remember the
absolutely.
Bob Newhart show actually in some ways more clearly. And the Bob Newhart was a little bit more like that Woody Allen-ish Dr. Katz vibe.
Yep.
I mean, very kind of self-depreciating, slightly confused character who's lovable as well.
You know, that sort of template of the Bob Newhart, Frasier, Dr. Katz kind of, slightly nebbishy kind of, but lovable guy was recently made use of in a very different kind of show. This program that's been streaming on Hulu recently called The Patient, which stars Steve Carell and Domhnall Gleeson. And I did watch the whole thing this week. Someone recommended it on our Instagram page, and so I submitted to it. And I have to say, it's a little too intense for me. I usually can't do this kind of thing. I took one for the team, and I did it to prep for this episode. But it was really, really good. It's excellent, but it's just sort of intense. It's just a little grim. Anyway, so we have Dr. Alan Strauss, who is a very human, likable, kind of ethical person whose wife has just died. He has 2 adult children, his daughter Shoshana and his son Ezra. And Ezra has disappointed him and his deceased wife by becoming Orthodox Jewish and marrying into an Orthodox family. And they're very upset about it. And you get the feeling that the wife's death and the estrangement are all fairly recent, within the past several years. And then he starts seeing this patient whose name we eventually find is Sam. But initially, this young man played by Domhnall Gleeson comes to his office, always has sunglasses on, doesn't really give him much. And finally, one day, Dr. Strauss says, I'm aware that I'm a little bit frustrated because I feel that we've been working together for a little while, and I'm not really getting to know you much better. And I'm aware of feeling frustrated. I wonder if you're aware of feeling the same thing, because usually when one person feels that way, the other person's feeling it too. And the next thing we know, Alan wakes up chained to the floor of Sam's house, and he is Sam's prisoner. And Sam reveals that the whole story, his name, he told Alan that his mother was dead. His mother was not dead. He'd made up a lie about where he worked. It was all a lie. He was kind of waiting to see if this was going to work. He had a big problem, and he needed Dr. Strauss to help him with it. And his problem was that he compulsively killed people. So now the psychologist is chained to the floor of the basement in the house with a serial killer being forced to do therapy with him. So it's a pretty intense setup. It's very well done. Dr. Strauss has these occasional kind of imaginary meetings with his own deceased analyst. And there are dream sequences, and it's really quite brilliant. And I have to say that Steve Carell, both of the performances are great, but in particular, Steve Carell is very believable as this fallible human being who's doing his best, and you're never sure if he's doing his best to help Sam or to try to save his own life or both. So it's really interesting. And one of the things that kind of came up for me is talk about a coercive transference. So this kind of metaphor of feeling chained in the space with this person. I mean, I think that in ways that are good and ways that are bad, therapists can feel like that sometimes. When someone comes into your office, their problems are no longer their problems. They become yours as well. In a way that can be very healing, and it's part of how therapy works. And it can sometimes feel really burdensome.
I think that quality of fallibility, as therapists are portrayed on the screen, is very important, and it's insightful of the screenwriters to show these all these so-called sources of wisdom, greater knowledge, et cetera, as also being incredibly human and susceptible to absolutely not getting what's going on at all. They sometimes miss it completely, as in Sixth Sense, where right? I don't know if I should announce a spoiler alert here or not, but the therapist does not get what is going on until the very, very end. Or my favorite totally fallible therapist is Monk, who is a detective who has OCD. And in some of the episodes, he's calling his therapist, or the therapist goes with him. He has a sort of nurse assistant who challenges him because there are things that he won't eat and can't eat, or he can't touch, or he can't go there. And yet that very fallibility also makes him especially astute, because he notices things in his OCD-like orientation that other people just don't notice. So there's a really endearing quality that we see both sides of this therapist and a number of others that we've already mentioned.
I was thinking about just circling back a bit to the idea of the patient, which I have not seen yet, but the idea of the patient feeling that he needs to kidnap his therapist and chain him up to have this unlimited access, that the patients need to be understood, and that now the therapist and the patient are both prisoners of his murderous complex, and that both of them, in a sense, are fighting for their life. The murderer fighting for his psychic life, the therapist fighting for his literal life in a way, and that both of them have to overcome this spirit of murder that's possessed the entire scenario.
Yeah.
I don't know how it ends, and I'll be curious to watch it. Lisa, where did you, what was the medium through which you viewed this? Is this on Netflix?
It's streaming on Hulu.
On Hulu.
Yeah. This actually has relevance to Jung, who had when he was a young psychiatrist and working at a hospital called the Berkolzi, he had a patient who was very delusional, and it turned out at the end that she had a gun, and she pulled it out of her bag and said, "Dr. Jung, if you had failed me, I would have shot you." And Jung relates that anecdote very powerfully, and fortunately, he did not fail her, at least in her estimation. But, this kind of bizarre scene, and that it actually is reflected sometimes not quite as literally. And of course, that's part of the Sixth Sense as well.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote, Deb. I had forgotten about that. And yeah, I talk about what's in the transference. But Joseph, it's a good point, because I think as a metaphor, what we know is that many times people can't necessarily communicate their psychic state to us in words alone. And so there will be this kind of occurrence in the field, this projective identification, in which we will begin to feel what the client feels. And the client will, if the client needs us to know how he or she is feeling, they will find a way to make us feel that way. So, for example, if someone's suffering from great shame, they may try to shame us. And then we leave and we're all ashamed and we're thinking, whoa, what was that? And then it's like, oh, this is... she needed me to know how it feels to be her. And I'm thinking that's maybe part of the metaphor in the patient, is that Domhnall Gleeson's character is trapped in this murderous complex. He was horribly abused by his father. And he needs to communicate that same sense of desperation and that same sense of how high the stakes are to Alan. And he, does it by kidnapping him and chaining him to the basement. the other thing that it does is it makes it clear that Sam's not going to feel comfortable being emotionally vulnerable unless he has complete control. And this is, something that can happen in therapy. I mean, Domhnall Gleeson's character is obviously sociopathic. And you see, Alan working with him, trying to teach him empathy. In some ways that, if it weren't so goddamn tense, it would be funny. But, it does happen that we sometimes find ourselves in the room with someone who is psychopathic. And we might feel that same fear that Alan's feeling. I mean, that can be an aspect of doing this work.
So we're talking about the countertransference. And when you were beginning, Lisa, we were in that realm of the syntonic countertransference, which is something I think that came out of Fordham's work, that sometimes the unconscious field will take a piece of psychological work from the client's psyche and place it into the analyst's psyche. And then the analyst winds up in their own dreams and self-reflections working through a Gordian knot, something that can't quite resolve. And then as the analyst figures a way out of the feeling state that's been imposed upon them, it communicates a kind of resolution possibility back to the patient. And often it's not until perhaps well into that, or perhaps after the resolution, that the analyst might realize that that actually wasn't my issue, that I was hatching something, working through something, metabolizing something, yes, pregnant with something on behalf of the patient. And it seems to be very much an unconscious agreement. The ego is not deciding to do this.
No, but it is the way that we take on the problems of our analysans, or that they become part of us, those problems.
And I think film does a wonderful job of admittedly fictionalizing, but nonetheless portraying this very real, deep, and important emotional truth. And that the therapists or analysts in film who do this really well, like Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, even Barbara Streisand in a very flawed film, I think, Prince of Tides. The people who can go there with the client, I'm thinking of the therapist too in Equus, a very deep, difficult film like this film you're talking about, The Patient, who can really traverse dark, difficult, painful territory, really does get our respect, even as a fictionalized character, for somebody able to dive the relational depths.
Deb, what you just said brings up for me the parallel between the process of watching a film and what partially happens in the analytic container is that a good film takes us into the subjective reality of the protagonist, or, just the same way a good book can do as well, so that we suddenly find ourselves kind of having that emotional experience that the other person is portrayed as having. And that is part of what happens in an analytic encounter as well, is that we as the analysts use our empathic imagination to conjure up in ourselves the feelings that our analysand is having. Just the same way that we do that when we're, passively watching a film or a TV show.
This reminds me of another movie, if I might, called The Cell, with Jennifer Lopez in it, which I really recommend. It's a very Jungian treatment of this, but in a nutshell, the FBI convinces a social worker to use a new kind of technology where her consciousness will be transported into the unconscious mind of a comatose killer, and then navigate through this really terrifying symbolic world in order to reach him. And as he is behind all of these terrible things, there is a small sliver of humanity inside of this person to try to get a sense of where one of his last living victims has been trapped and, of course, is in danger, in life-threatening danger. And because the killer is now comatose, there's no hope of getting any kind of conscious rapport with it. But as she navigates this terrifying archetypal world, she takes us with her in this journey, which speaks to what you guys were talking about, that heroic capacity to engage the demonic, the incredible darkness, which is also part of the human soul. I'd like to make a transition, if it's okay, to another interesting phenomena, the curiosity in the therapeutic process in general. And I had just on Netflix watched something called Stutz, Stutz, which is a documentary made by Jonah Hill, that many of you might know as a famous comedian actor. And he invited his therapist, who he feels had given him an enormous amount of help, to participate in a documentary about their work. And in order to introduce his therapist, Phil Stutz, to the world at large, Dr. Stutz has been surviving Parkinson's disease for many years. And there's a sense in the documentary that this is both a tribute to the healing relationship for Jonah Hill, but also a way of capturing this man's life work before he passes away. It's a deeply intimate kind of expose about the tremendous depth of feeling that both of these men have for each other and the arc of their work together. It seems to be particularly popular on Netflix right now, but it speaks to our curiosity, the way that we want to be able to reach into these healing relationships and understand more about them. I think there's something to be said about how the client or the patient then has a story, is living in a story about their therapy that also needs to be told as part of the healing process, as part of the integration of the change process. And that Jonah Hill is brave enough to put his very private inner work out there in the field to inform the public in general. And this is very congruent with the book that we had talked about a while ago, We Are the Light, when we interviewed Matthew Quick, also bringing forward this idea of the transformative process of therapy.
And the willingness to put the protagonist down on the page with all the life issues and so on. But I'm going to your theme here of documentaries about therapy, and another one is couples therapy, which is a real-time series. I think it went a couple of years, where the therapist, and she really is a therapist, called Orna Goralnik, has couples in her consulting room, and we see actual real-time interviews with a number of them at crucial, pivotal, important moments in their process, where they, like Jonah Hill, have been willing to let themselves be seen for who they are and the dilemmas that they face for really a greater good, because we do want to reach into our own depths through others. It's like having a guide on a trek through the Himalayas, so that we can follow in their footsteps, have a little more insight into ourselves. Oh, I'm not so different from that. That reminds me, helps me identify what might be going on with me.
I think this question about why are we so fascinated with therapy, why is it portrayed so many times, raises some really interesting possibilities. One is, I think, Joseph, you were getting at this, it's a private space. No one knows what goes on in that room other than the therapist and the client. And so, and there's a taboo about penetrating that space. So there's something intensely fascinating about it to bring a camera in, whether it's in a kind of documentary sense or in the fictional sense. And I also think that a therapeutic process is a little bit like a good mystery or a yarn. Someone comes in oftentimes with some problem and there's no clear answer to it. And maybe it's a mystery, in Hitchcock's Spellbound, the Gregory Peck character has, this kind of mysterious symptom and he's an amnesiac and what's really going on. And Ingrid Bergman is a psychiatrist who has to unravel it to understand. And it's like, that's the answer. So it's almost like a good whodunit. But it is a naturally narrative sort of structure that kind of posits a problem in the beginning, and through a slow unraveling, hopefully there's some kind of resolution. I also want to say that I think another reason why therapy in film and TV is so common is because it can play a nice sort of foil against the outer events of the person's lives. It creates a mechanism through which we can explore what's going on in the person's inner life. So I'm thinking of that another really famous one that we can't not mention, which is Dr. Melfi in The Sopranos. And we've got, Tony's life as a mobster, and then we've got, Tony on the couch, although he's not actually on a couch. But, sort of what does he think about when that door is closed and he's in a private space? And the mechanism of having him be in analysis kind of creates an opportunity to explore a different side of the character.
Well, my favorite thing about Dr. Melfi in The Sopranos was her outstandingly perfect Brooklyn accent, which I personally related to most of all in her so-called therapeutic process with Tony Soprano. But I'm back to the point you're leading to, Lisa, about story. And what is our story about the therapeutic process? Something happens in the room, and then one way or another, filmmakers construct a story about it and connect the dots between that person's outer life, like Tony Soprano's, as a way of seeing into his or her inner life. So I think one of the things we really see with Tony Soprano is his incredible ability to split what he really does in outer life as a mobster from who he is in the consulting room as a basically, just a regular guy. And he has family problems. He has problems with his marriage. He worries about his kids. And it's not until the end, I think, that our Dr. Melfi really catches on to the fact that Tony Soprano is a sociopath.
I don't think we would have an argument about that. But
okay. Argue with me. You think she sees him more accurately?
No. Well, I just think it's questionable if he actually is a sociopath, because the social milieu that he's in, his behavior is very normative within that milieu,
which is sociopathic.
Okay.
But I think I do want to pick up on something that you said often inside me, which is that she does do her job as a therapist up until the end when she fires him, but we can only work with what our clients bring to us. And Tony does not bring any guilt or remorse or even just ambivalence about the things that he does in his quote normative unquote work world.
Yeah, he acts out a lot, doesn't he?
A murder here and there.
It does speak to the long process that it can often take for a client or a patient to incrementally bring in all parts of themselves into the therapeutic process, to have at least one human being stitch together the whole story. Because most of us, restrained by all kinds of things, including consequences, are hesitant to reveal all parts of ourselves to any one person. Sometimes we don't even reveal all parts of ourselves to ourselves. So the therapist becomes the one person sitting at the loom, so to speak, weaving story after story after story together, and at some point having at least a single tapestry of our lives, and that there is something in the human soul that longs for that. It often gets projected onto the divine lover, the anonymous figure, that the person who I'm finally going to fall in love with, who's going to complete me, will know all of me. People come into therapy, and perhaps not initially, but deep down, they are also wanting that experience of being totally known in a way that they weren't as a child or can't be as an adult.
And isn't that what we hope for when we go into therapy, is that, just as you said, Joseph, we need to be revealed to ourselves. And we are hoping very much that analyst or therapist can reveal us to ourselves and bring us into wholeness. And sometimes we see this beautifully and poignantly depicted on the screen.
Which is why I think we're fascinated by that. We're fascinated by the promise of being known at that depth. And we want to believe that that's possible, even if it's just in a movie. I think we also fear the power of somebody who knows our story. So depicting therapists as silly or humorous depotentiates them, which makes them less frightening. We also project all kinds of material onto our therapists, so it's fun to see therapists demonized and dark, ridiculous, whether that's Dr. Smith or some other dangerous figure.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh,
like
yes.
Nurse Ratched. So it speaks to all the different ways that the individual and the collective psyche make use of the literal analyst, but also the analyst who's now become a figure in the culture itself. And to me, that partakes of the archetype of Mercury Hermes, which I'd mentioned early on.
Yeah.
That Hermes is the psychopomp who can travel everywhere and ostensibly remain uninjured. He's also the master of disguises. So in one movie, he looks like a despot. In another, he's a sex object. In another, he's a genius. In another, he's a hero. And that mercurial archetype, which I think is present in the identity of the analyst, also is moving through the culture as a whole. The psychopomp is, the revealer of the soul, the companion of the soul as it journeys through all of its realms. So that spirit, I think, is also dancing with all of its comedy and tragedy and insightfulness through the collective as expressed in arts of all kind.
I want to lift up what you just pointed out about our fear of the therapist and his or her power and the potential dark side of the therapist that was rivetingly portrayed as Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who was obsessed with power. And that's part of the tension, I think, in film and in analysis in our consulting rooms, is this sort of approach avoidance. Can I trust you? Will you use your power safely? And it can be used destructively, which we see in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
So on that dark, An ominous final note. Perhaps it's time to transition into a dream.
Okay.
Before we go to our dream for today, I want to just remind listeners about Dream School. So if you think that what we do on the podcast with dreams is pretty cool, we want to let you know that we have a program where we will teach you to be able to work with your own dreams in a similar manner. So Dream School has 12 months of material. There are audio lectures from the three of us. There's written material. There's exercises. There's a community. There's live events. I always do a live dream seminar every month, which is really great fun. We work with a dream from someone in Dream School, and we have the dreamer there anonymously, and so that he or she can answer questions. Joseph does a live Q&A, and Deb has office hours where you can meet with Deb one-to-one in person. Well, on Zoom, but live. So it's a very rich program, and we're actually offering 10% off right now until the end of the year. So you can go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and take a look at Dream School. So we hope to see some of you there.
This week's dreamer is a woman. She's 22, and she is a student. Here's the dream. I was attending a drag show, but I put on a costume and began to perform on stage. I was a background performer for someone else, and I was just walking around the stage. I felt like I wasn't wearing the costume that I wanted to wear. I didn't feel comfortable or confident. And I also felt like I wasn't getting cheered on by the crowd. I got off the stage and felt unseen. I remember seeing a pill bottle and not knowing what it was. I took a pill. It was someone else's medication that I stole. I spent the rest of the dream trying to hide in shame from taking someone else's medicine and anxiously awaiting to see what the pill was going to do to me. For context, she says, I'm a studio art major entering into my final semester of college. I have recently received rejection letters from a major exhibition and a grant opportunity. The main feelings in the dream, she says, were shame, anxiety, and desperation. And she adds, for additional context, I attended a drag show the night before the dream. I also struggled with substance abuse in high school, but I made sobriety a goal in college. I've been completely sober from all substances for a few months now.
Well, there's a lot in this dream. I'm aware that the dreamer early on notes that she has put on a costume.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something here about persona. And maybe that persona doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel authentic somehow. This is not the costume she wants to be wearing. And she's not getting a lot of accolades for it, which might relate to the experience of being turned down for the exhibition and the grant opportunity. It may be that right now this is feeling ill-fitting.
One of the lenses that I might use here is about the archetype of Dionysus and the history of Dionysus as the god of theater. She's going into this theater environment where there's a drag show. She herself puts on a costume and begins to participate in this Dionysic revelry. But it's not a good fit for her. She's not receiving good feedback from the psychic environment in general, although it is important that she's also not being punished for it, that she's kind of trying something on, she's having her experience, she's able to move in and out of the experience. So it seems like the psyche is like an observing parent right now, just kind of letting her play dress up to have her own experience. She sees some pills, and we know from the context that she has struggled with substance abuse of some kind, and that she's only been sober for a few months. She returns to that environment of taking somebody else's medication or putting in her body some substance that she doesn't know enough about. And yes, she may be taking something that another person needs, but also that she's putting her body at risk by putting something in there that she doesn't know. She becomes anxious and ashamed. I'm thinking that she has a relationship to that Dionysic place, a craving to have some kind of experience beyond herself, to take on the garb of the Maenads, for instance. But at this point, while the psyche is not actively interfering with it, it is something that she can choose or not choose to be involved in. And I think in a fairly subtle way, the psyche is allowing her to experience the negative feelings that come up when she attempts to garb herself in that Dionysic world of dismemberment and ecstasy and destruction and rebirth. One of the difficulties of the Dionysic archetype when it activates in a very young person is that they're too young to participate in that cycle of death and rebirth, that they themselves are still trying to be born, trying to firm up the structures that they need to survive. Perhaps in midlife or even later, it becomes more important to break down the old thing. And I think that speaks to the resurgence in interest in ayahuasca experiences and psilocybin experiences and other kinds of Dionysic immersions where people can go into the unconscious, return to their component parts, and then be reborn after that kind of initiatic encounter.
Mm-hmm.
But when that happens to young people, it's like they keep pressing the reset button too early so that they don't have a chance to build enough stamina and steam in the beginning. So I think the dream is giving her some advice, is giving her a bit of negative feedback about the descent into the Dionysic fantasy, which I suspect is trying to pull her back away from the impulse to use substances, for instance, to overcome her anxiety, or to participate in a kind of destructive revelry relative to her own psyche.
My thoughts on this are in alignment with both of yours, but I'm looking through the lens of transformation and the hoped for transformation that has two significant sort of scenes or images in the dream. First is that she's performing in a drag show and isn't comfortable with that. It's not working and she's not getting good feedback. And the second is seeking transformation by taking a medication, taking a pill. Maybe that will change me. And once again, the dream maker says, this is not the way to go because our dream ego is anxiously waiting to see if something bad is going to happen to her. And she feels very guilty for having stolen something that someone else presumably needs. I think where I am for my imagining of the dreamer is an awareness of the anxiety around being a student who's entering into the last lap of college and not being received with accolades and affirmation in her job applications so far from an exhibition and a grant opportunity. And there's always anxiety around, now you're leaving the alma mater, the all-mother, for the big, wide, tumultuous world. And but the way out is not to put on a costume, a persona. And it is also not the sudden transformation that medication can, hopefully afford. Those two roads are not the way to go.
I have a couple more thoughts about it. I think just taking maybe this train of thought just a little bit further. First of all, I noticed that this dream is roughly split up into two parts, and that both involve some kind of hiding. So in the first part, she is wearing a costume and she doesn't feel seen. And then she takes the medication and then she tries to hide. So there's something about not being able to be seen, not wanting to be seen, maybe some ambivalence about that. I also want to offer that, although I agree with everything both of you have said about the substance use and the medication, I do want to mention that there's possibly a paradoxical, almost opposite sense of it as well, because it is medication. So what is the medicine that her psyche is seeking? And sometimes stealing in a dream, it feels transgressive. The ego is reaching for something, but it can be a healthy impulse. So she steals medication. Is that the image of a healthy impulse toward reaching for something that feels like it shouldn't be hers, that is medicinal? And she's waiting to see what this medicine is going to do. We don't know that it's going to do anything bad. She's waiting to see. So I think there is, if we think about the prospective function of the stream or where the telos is, although I think it could absolutely be related to the substance use, just like you both said, I wonder if there's also another way to read it where there's an impulse toward reaching for something medicinal. After all, she did write this dream down and send it to us.
Yes, I absolutely can align with that. The seeking for medicine, seeking for healing. One piece that I want to lift up in this vein, that the dream ego wears a costume, performs, and feels unseen. So just looking at those three ideas. And so the dream is also, perhaps, asking her to be aware of the way that she may be colluding with being unseen. And this is also part of being a young person. The culture seems to tell us who we should be in order to attract attention, success, be noticed by the right people. And so there's an enormous pressure to put on whatever the persona is that seems to be required in order to get the treasures of the collective offered to us, and to perform the role, perhaps the role of the visual artist, as she perceives that, to costume herself in how that seems to look or needs to look in order to be noticed. And she's also feeling unseen as she attempts that. So while we could say, yes, not being given the opportunity to participate in a major exposition, that also can make one feel unseen. But the dream isn't commenting on that per se. It's commenting more on costume and performance. And this is something that Jung was very interested in. Again, he thought was more of a crisis of midlife. But as an artist who is intrinsically reaching into herself to find what is true, being able to make manifest the irrational, the soulful in the psyche, that she is precociously bringing forward her authentic gold, as many young artists do, and caught in that tension between being authentic as an artist and yet finding the right persona to navigate with the collective, which is part of getting one's art sold and making a living. So that tension and that dance between the authentic and the role, the soul, which is the spirit of the depths, and what's required to market your stuff, which is the spirit of the times. And as she moves between those worlds, she also has a sense of shame. I think that artists can feel shame simply by extroverting their art, just taking something that is a secret gold inside of us and introducing it to the collective can be deeply painful for an artist, although the spirit of creativity demands it of them. So that alone can be a painful process, as well as seeing how the collective handles our gold. And if they mishandle it or reject it or comment on it in certain ways, that can also leave us feeling psychically injured and shamed. So there's a number of areas for growth in medicine, as you were leading to, Lisa, which comes with time. Can the ego develop enough strength to tolerate extroverting the golden secrets of the artist's psyche and submitting it to being handled or mishandled by the collective or by the purchaser? What is the persona of the successful artist that also can negotiate with the collective and market her gifts so that she can actually have a living and get paid for the work that she wants to do?
So really what we're saying here, what you're saying is that this is a lot about rejection. The rejection she's experienced in applying for grants and an exhibition, and that is imaged in the dream as feeling unseen, essentially rejected by the audience when she's performing in the drag show. The rejection, in effect, from the pill of it may have bad effects, that it will not give her what she wants. And I think you've spoken so well to the tension in a young person who is an artist and putting out one's own self in a certain sense, one's inner gold, as you said. And so to have that be rejected is especially painful because it is so closely aligned with one's own depths, one's self that's out there on the line. And I think I just want to say that is part of being an artist at a young stage of life, that you're 22. And this is a road that carries that risk.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.
There are so many comedic therapists or shows that are, I'm sorry, I'm so distracted because there's a crow right outside. Paul, you got to take this out while I just stare at this crow. Hi, crow. You're so pretty. Oh my God.
We're all therapists, okay. And we're talking like this right now. Don't be nervous, anyone.
Okay.
Paul, leave it in.
This way when we're working with you.
Oh God. Anyway. Oh yeah.